The road that went silent. At 4:17 in the morning on October 10, 1941, on a narrow road west of Vyazma, the lead vehicle of a German armored column was moving through the dark with its engine low and uneven, its tracks grinding over frozen mud that had not yet fully turned to winter ground. Inside the tank, the air was stale. Oil, sweat, cold metal, and cordite clung to everything. The driver could barely see beyond the slit in front of him. Somewhere behind, trucks waited nose to tail, carrying fuel cans, ammunition boxes, spare track links, tired infantrymen, field radios, bread, wounded men, and orders that already felt older than the war around them. The map said the road was open. The men believed the road was open. That was the first mistake. A few meters ahead, beneath a thin skin of dirt and crushed grass, something waited without noise, without heat, without a crew, without fear. It was not a T-34. It was not a gun hidden in the treeline. It was not a Soviet infantryman with a grenade in his fist. It was just a mine. The tank rolled forward. Then the road lifted. The blast came from underneath, not from the horizon. The sound was blunt, hard, intimate. A flash under the left track. A heavy crack of steel. The vehicle lurched, twisted, and stopped at an angle across the road. Its broken tracks spilled like torn chain beside it. For a second, no one behind it moved. Engines idled in the darkness. Men looked toward the sound but could not see the enemy. That was what made it worse. A machine gun could be answered. An anti-tank gun could be spotted. A mortar could be triangulated. But the ground did not reveal itself. The ground simply waited. A radio operator shouted into static. The commander of the next vehicle leaned out, then dropped back down as rifle fire snapped somewhere in the distance. Someone yelled for engineers. Someone else yelled not to move. A truck driver, 20 vehicles back, could not see the destroyed tank. He only heard the explosion, then the order passing backward in fragments. Stop. Do not advance. Possible mines. The word traveled faster than any officer could control it. Mines. The column that had been built for movement became a line of trapped machines. The road was too narrow. The ditches were too soft. The trees pressed close on both sides. To reverse meant confusion. To go around meant trusting the dark ground beside the road. To stay meant waiting for Soviet artillery to find them. And somewhere beyond the trees, Soviet sappers who had worked through the night did not need to watch the explosion to know what had happened. They had chosen the road because the Germans needed it. They had placed the mine not where it would look dramatic on a map, but where one stopped vehicle would become more than one stopped vehicle. They understood something the German column had not yet accepted. A mine did not need to destroy a division. It only needed to make the division stop. That morning, the men in the column still believed they were facing a crude obstacle, the kind engineers could clear, mark, report, and leave behind. But the real danger was already spreading through the road, through the radio net, through every driver's hands tightening on the controls. Because after the first mine exploded, every meter ahead became a question. And the Germans had built their war on answers. Primitive weapons for a primitive army. To understand why the German army underestimated Soviet mines, it is necessary to understand what the Germans thought they had already learned. By the summer of 1941, German armored forces had crossed Europe with a terrifying confidence. Poland had collapsed. France had fallen in weeks. Roads, rivers, borders, fortifications. All of them had been crossed, bypassed, broken through, or turned into symbols of German speed. The Panzer arm was not just a collection of tanks. It was an idea. Movement could become shock. Shock could become paralysis. Paralysis could become victory. In that kind of war, anything that stood still looked old. A mine stood still. It had no engine, no turret, no radio, no commander speaking through headphones. It did not maneuver. It did not pursue. Could not exploit a breakthrough. Could not retreat when outflanked. On paper, it seemed almost passive. A thing to be discovered, marked, cleared, and forgotten. German officers had seen mines before. They had engineer units. They had procedures. They had men trained to probe the soil, cut wires, lift explosives, and open lanes. They had diagrams, manuals, discipline. They did not enter the Soviet Union as amateurs. That was why the mistake was so dangerous. It was not ignorance. It was familiarity. The Germans believed they understood the category. They knew what a mine was. They knew what it could do to a wheel, a track, a boot, a careless hand. But they often thought of it as a tactical nuisance, not as a weapon that could challenge the deeper logic of armored war. And at first, that belief seemed reasonable. Soviet forces in 1941 were often retreating under impossible pressure. Units were cut off. Communications failed. Supply systems broke apart. Commanders lost contact with armies that existed on maps but were already scattered across forests, roads, and burning villages. In the German imagination, Soviet mine warfare belonged to that same picture. Rough, improvised, desperate, primitive. A wooden box in the dirt. A metal plate beneath mud. An explosive charge buried by men who lacked better weapons. There was some truth in the image. Soviet mines could be simple. Many were not elegant machines. Some were crude by the standards of more complex weapons. Sappers sometimes worked with limited tools, incomplete maps, little time, and no guarantee that their own troops would not later stumble into the danger they had created. But simplicity in war is not the same as weakness. A simple weapon can be built quickly, carried by hand, hidden in bad weather, placed by tired men, replaced after bombardment, used in mud, snow, forests, villages, and ruined roads where more sophisticated systems fail. A simple weapon does not ask for perfect conditions. The Eastern Front did not offer perfect conditions. It offered distances that swallowed fuel, roads that dissolved into mud, snow that erased tracks, villages burned into skeletons, forest lines where visibility could shrink to a few dozen meters. It offered front lines that bent, broke, reformed, and disappeared overnight. In that world, a mine was not primitive because it lacked sophistication. It was dangerous because it matched the battlefield. German commanders believed mines belonged to the margins of battle. The real struggle, they thought, would be decided by tanks, guns, air support, fuel, and command speed. Mines were something for engineers to handle after the armored spearhead had done its work. But Soviet sappers saw another possibility. They did not need mines to replace tanks. They needed mines to interrupt tanks. They needed them to slow the first vehicle, crowd the second, confuse the third, and force the entire line into hesitation. They needed the German army to become cautious for just long enough to lose tempo. And tempo was one of the few things Germany could not afford to lose. The Germans had entered the Soviet Union believing movement would solve problems. Soon, they would discover that the Soviets had learned to attack movement itself. A mine does not need to kill a tank. A tank destroyed in battle is easy to understand. There is smoke, fire, a crater, a report, a number placed beside a unit name, one vehicle lost, one crew missing, wounded, or dead. The battlefield absorbs the fact and moves on. But a mine did not always work that cleanly. Sometimes it did not kill the crew. Sometimes it did not burn the vehicle. Sometimes it did not even destroy the tank beyond repair. It broke a track, damaged a road wheel, jammed a suspension arm, twisted metal just enough to make movement impossible. To a clerk reading a report that might look minor. To the men behind the tank, it could be disaster. A panzer column on a narrow road was not a loose crowd of machines. It was a sequence. Each vehicle depended on the one ahead. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, fuel vehicles, artillery tractors, ambulances, command cars, all threaded along the same path because the terrain allowed little else. One disabled vehicle in the wrong place could become a gate no one could open. Then the real cost began. An engineer team had to move forward. Not standing upright, not calmly, often crawling, crouching, exposed to rifle fire, mortar bursts, or artillery that might already be registered on the road. They had to determine whether the explosion was isolated or part of a field. They had to probe the soil, inch by inch, with hands made clumsy by cold, fatigue, and fear. A recovery vehicle had to be brought forward. But if the road was mined, bringing another heavy machine into the same zone was its own risk. If the disabled tank was under fire, Attaching cables became an act of patience under death. If the road was muddy, the recovery itself could become another blockage. If the column tried to bypass, wheels could sink, tracks could slide, and vehicles could wander into more mines. This was the hidden arithmetic of mine warfare. The mine itself was only the first event. The pause was the weapon. The Germans counted vehicles. The Soviets counted minutes. One stop tank could delay 10 vehicles. 10 vehicles delayed could hold up a battalion. A battalion delayed could miss an attack window. A missed attack window could give Soviet infantry time to withdraw, artillery time to reposition, engineers time to prepare the next obstacle, commanders time to form another defensive line. The mine did not need to win the battle in the moment it exploded. It only needed to steal time. And on the Eastern Front, time had weight. Time meant fuel burned by idling engines. Men standing in cold wind beside vehicles they could not move. Radio nets crowded with incomplete messages. Officers trying to match maps to terrain they could barely see. Artillery crews waiting for target coordinates. Soviet observers listening for engines, then hearing them stop. The German armor doctrine was designed around keeping the enemy off balance. Speed reduced the opponent's ability to think, regroup, or react. Mines reversed that pressure. They made the attacker slow down and think about the ground. They gave the defender a voice even after retreating. A minefield could say, "Not here," or "Not yet," or "Only at a price." That was what German commanders had not fully appreciated. They had treated mines as objects. Soviet engineers used them as decisions. Every mine placed on a road forced a German commander to choose between caution and speed. Every suspected minefield created another decision. Send engineers forward and lose time. Bypass and risk more vehicles. Push through and accept losses. Stop and invite artillery. None of those choices were good. That was the point. What they believed was that mines were obstacles. What really happened was that mines became a language of control. And the men who spoke that language best were not famous generals. They were usually cold, tired, mud-covered sappers working in the dark while history looked somewhere else. The men beneath the battlefield. The Soviet sapper did not usually look like the man who would stop a panzer column. He was not sitting in a tank turret. He was not standing beside a famous gun. He was not framed by propaganda as the clean symbol of modern war. More often, he was bent over in the mud with a shovel, a mine, a length of wire, or a wooden stake, listening for engines that might already be too close. His work was slow. War around him was not. That was part of the terror. A sapper laying mines at night had to imagine the battle before it arrived. He had to read the ground the way a hunter reads tracks. Which road would the Germans need? Which bridge approach could not be avoided? Which frozen field looked firm enough for tanks? Which village entrance would invite a column to slow down? Where would the lead vehicle be most likely to stop? Where would the second vehicle try to turn? The best place for a mine was not always the most obvious place. It was the place where fear could multiply. Soviet engineers often worked under brutal limits. There was rarely enough time. Sometimes there were not enough mines. Sometimes maps were incomplete or lost. Sometimes orders changed before the work was finished. Units retreated through areas that had just been prepared, and confusion could become deadly. A minefield that harmed the enemy could also endanger friendly troops if marking, memory, or communication failed. There was no romance in this. The sapper's hands were close to the thing that could kill him. In cold weather, fingers stiffened. In mud, fuses could clog, tools slipped, and holes filled with water. In darkness, a small mistake became invisible until it was final. If artillery began to fall, the instinct was to press into the earth, the same earth being prepared to explode later. Some men carried mines on their backs. Some dragged them forward in carts or crates. Some buried them near roads while German patrols moved nearby. Some laid anti-tank mines, others anti-personnel mines, others charges prepared for bridges, culverts, or rail lines. The details varied. The fear did not. A sapper could finish his work and never know whether it mattered. He might be ordered back before dawn. He might be killed in shellfire. He might be overrun. He might later hear from someone else that a German vehicle had stopped at the road he prepared. Or he might hear nothing at all. This is one reason mine warfare disappears so easily from memory. A tank battle leaves wrecks. An air battle leaves claims. A famous commander leaves memoirs. But a sapper leaves disturbed soil, a field sketch, maybe a warning marker, maybe a report written in language too plain for what the work required. Yet those men saw something clearly. They saw that German strength had habits. German armor needed roads more often than its legend admitted. It needed fuel trucks. It needed bridges. It needed repair crews. It needed engineers of its own. It needed ground firm enough to carry weight. It needed confidence that the path ahead remained usable. Mines attacked those needs. The Soviet sapper did not have to defeat the Panzer as a machine. He had to defeat the system that allowed the Panzer to keep moving. A mine on its own was small. A mine placed at a choke point, watched by artillery, covered by anti-tank guns, or hidden near a forced detour could become part of something much larger. That was the sapper's battlefield. Not the shining battlefield of flags and charges. The underside of war. Mud, wire, timber, frozen dirt, broken bridges, ditches, road junctions, culverts, village lanes. The places commanders marked with symbols and drivers trusted with their lives. What German officers often saw as crude labor was, in practice, a form of anticipation. The sapper fought tomorrow's battle tonight. And when the German engines came in the morning, the first explosion was not improvisation. It was a message sent from the dark, turning retreat into a trap. Retreat is usually remembered as absence. A line breaks, troops fall back, vehicles burn, roads fill with men moving away from the enemy. Maps are redrawn, villages change hands. Commanders speak of withdrawal, adjustment, regrouping. Soldiers know the simpler word, leaving. But on the Eastern Front, leaving did not always mean surrendering the ground completely. Sometimes the ground was left armed. For Soviet forces under pressure in 1941 and 1942, retreat could be chaotic, costly, and humiliating. Units were cut apart. Command posts lost contact. Orders arrived too late or not at all. Men marched without sleep. Civilians fled along the same roads that armies needed. Bridges were blown. Fuel dumps burned. Horses died in harness. Vehicles were abandoned when they could not be repaired. To the advancing Germans, captured ground often looked like proof that momentum still belonged to them. A village emptied of organized resistance. A trench line abandoned. A bridge damaged but passable. A road open enough for tanks. But Soviet engineers could turn those same places into unfinished battles. A retreating army knows where the enemy is likely to go because it has just used those same roads itself. It knows which bridge matters, which ford looks shallow, which bend forces vehicles to slow, which lane through a village is too narrow for easy turning, which patch of ground looks safe because many boots have already crossed it. That knowledge could be weaponized. Mines could be placed near road exits, bridge approaches, abandoned defensive positions, likely parking areas, or stretches where a lead vehicle would block everything behind it. Charges could be left in culverts. Obstacles could be combined with demolition, fallen trees, burned vehicles, or artillery zones. Even when resources were limited, the right placement mattered more than the number. This was the idea that German commanders were slow to respect. They often measured Soviet retreat as loss of control. But Soviet sappers could use retreat as preparation. Empty ground did not mean harmless ground. An abandoned village did not mean a silent village. A damaged bridge did not mean a safe bridge. The Germans believed they were entering spaces from which the enemy had fled. But sometimes the enemy had left behind a version of himself. Patient, buried, impossible to interrogate. There was also a psychological cruelty to this kind of warfare. Soldiers entering captured ground wanted to relax. Not fully, never completely, but enough to breathe. A village taken after a fight promised cover, food, shelter from wind, maybe a stove, maybe a place to sit. A road cleared by scouts promised movement. A bridge still standing promised progress. Mines took that promise away. They made victory feel unstable. A German soldier could survive the firefight and die stepping into a doorway. A driver could cross miles of enemy country and lose his vehicle at a bend where no one fired. A commander could mark a village as captured, then spend the next morning clearing the road beyond it while the Soviets formed another line farther east. This did not make Soviet retreats painless or perfectly organized. Many were disasters. Many minefields were laid in haste. Some failed. Some were bypassed. Some were forgotten. Some caused tragedies among civilians or friendly forces. War did not sort cleanly between cleverness and suffering. But the larger pattern mattered. German speed depended on turning retreat into collapse. Soviet mine warfare helped turn retreat into delay. And delay, repeated often enough, could become resistance. By the time a German column reached a road junction that had been prepared overnight, the Soviet men who buried the mines might already be gone. Their footprints might be covered by frost. Their unit might be several kilometers away. Their names might never appear in a German report. But the column would still stop. And once it stopped, the question changed. Not where is the enemy, but how much of the ground did he leave behind? When the column stops, the first vehicle stopped because of the mine. The rest stopped because of uncertainty. That distinction mattered. A column under fire can sometimes push forward through danger. Drivers know the road. Commanders know the direction. Everyone understands the risk, even if fear is rising in their throats. Keep moving. Keep distance. Clear the kill zone. Do not become a target that waits. But mines made movement itself suspect. After the first blast, the next order was rarely simple. The commander could not just wave the second vehicle around the first. The shoulder might be mined. The ditch might be soft. The field beyond the ditch might hide more charges. The road ahead might contain another mine placed exactly where a driver would naturally turn. The column became a trapped thought. A German pioneer team moved forward. They were not the men shown in armored propaganda. They carried probes, tools, cables, markers, sometimes detectors depending on place and period, and always the knowledge that the safest-looking patch of earth could be the last thing they touched. Under ideal conditions, mine clearing was slow. Under fire, it became something else. A man on his stomach in the road, pushing a probe into frozen mud, cannot hurry simply because a colonel is angry. He has to feel. Too much force, and he may detonate what he is trying to find. Too little, and he may miss it. His helmet rim cuts his vision. His breath fogs and vanishes. Behind him, engines idle. Ahead of him, the disabled tank smokes. Somewhere to the left, a Soviet machine gun opens in short bursts, not necessarily to kill him, but to make his hands less steady. Then the artillery begins. Not always immediately, often after the column has already revealed where it is stuck. That was part of the Soviet method when mines were integrated into a larger defense. The mine halted, the road crowded, the radios filled with reports. Then guns, mortars, or anti-tank weapons could work against an enemy whose movement had been taken away. This was the moment when German assumptions began to break. They had thought of mines as things to be cleared before the battle continued. But here, clearing the mines was the battle. Every minute exposed the column. Every delay gave Soviet observers more time. Every attempt to bypass risked another explosion. The men in the rear could not see enough to understand the situation. The men in front understood too much. A second vehicle tried to edge around the crippled tank. The driver took it slowly, almost gently, as if caution could make steel lighter. The right track slipped into the shoulder. Mud rose. Someone shouted. The vehicle corrected. A few more meters. Then another blast. This one did not sound larger. It sounded final. Two vehicles now blocked the road. Behind them, an officer made a decision that would look neat only if written later. Halt the column. Bring up more engineers. Mark the lane. Prepare for fire. Find a bypass. Request artillery support. Report delay. On the ground, it was smoke, shouting, and men trying not to step where another man had just died. Somewhere nearby, a Soviet sapper's work had become bigger than the man who performed it. The minefield did not need to be dense across every meter. It needed to be convincing. It needed to teach the Germans that the obvious solution might be the next trap. That lesson traveled backward through the column. Drivers stopped trusting the road. Infantrymen watched their boots. Officers stopped trusting the map. Even when a lane was cleared, the memory of the first explosion stayed in the body. Men moved differently after that. A little slower, a little tighter, a little more aware of the earth beneath them. What they had believed was that minefields interrupted the advance. What really happened was more dangerous. The minefield changed the men who had to advance through it. And once German soldiers began to fear not only the enemy ahead, but the ground below, the Soviet defense had gained something no report could fully measure. It had entered their judgment. The ground becomes the enemy. Fear of mines does not remain inside the minefield. It spreads. That is why mines could have an effect beyond their numbers. A field with 10 mines could make men imagine 100. A road with one confirmed blast could make every ditch, rut, plank, and patch of disturbed soil feel deliberate. A vehicle lost to a mine could change how an entire unit moved for the rest of the day. The German army depended on discipline, and discipline could manage fear. But it could not erase uncertainty from the ground itself. By 1942, and especially into the great defensive battles of 1943, Soviet mine warfare had grown more systematic. Minefields could be tied into anti-tank guns, artillery fire, trenches, natural obstacles, and prepared defensive belts. At Kursk, Soviet defenses became dense, layered, and difficult to rush through. The exact numbers varied across sectors and reports, and many should be handled carefully, but the central reality is clear. German armor did not face one obstacle. It faced a system designed to slow, channel, damage, and exhaust it before the decisive fight even began. That was the reversal. The Germans had once believed that Soviet mines were crude because they were simple. The Soviets used that simplicity at scale. A mine did not need to be clever if it was placed in the right field, before the right gun line, along the right approach, under the right conditions. It did not need to destroy a Tiger or a Panzer IV outright. If it broke a track, it could expose the vehicle. If it forced a detour, it could lead the tank toward anti-tank guns. If it delayed the advance, it could give Soviet artillery more time to fire. If it made the formation bunch up, it could turn order into congestion. A tank is powerful when moving. A halted tank is still dangerous. But it is also located. This was the part German commanders could not ignore forever. Mines did not merely sit beneath the battle. They shaped the battle above them. They influenced where vehicles went, how quickly engineers could work, how commanders judged risk, and how much confidence crews had in the next 50 meters. The battlefield became slower, narrower, more suspicious. A commander looking through binoculars might see open ground. His drivers saw possible death. A staff officer might draw an arrow across a map. The pioneer crawling ahead of the tanks knew that the arrow had to pass through dirt, roots, stones, wire, buried metal, and someone else's preparation. Maps make movement look smooth. Minefields make it physical. There is an old temptation in military history to focus on the visible duel. Tank against tank, gun against armor, aircraft against target. Those things matter. They are dramatic because they are visible. But mines belong to the less visible layer of war, the layer that determined whether the duel happened on favorable terms at all. The Soviets did not need every German tank to be destroyed by mines. They needed the German attack to arrive slower, more crowded, more cautious, and more tired. They needed engineers pulled forward. They needed artillery to find stationary targets. They needed the Panzer commanders to hesitate at exactly the moment doctrine demanded momentum. Hesitation was not cowardice. It was information. The information was simple. The ground could kill you. And once that information entered a unit, it could not be easily removed. Even after a lane was cleared, doubt remained at the edge of every track. Crews watched for markers. Infantrymen scanned the road. Officers asked whether the field had really been cleared. Engineers became more valuable, more overworked, more necessary. A minefield did not just stop machines. It rearranged trust. Trust in roads. trust in maps, trust in speed, trust in the assumption that the enemy had to be visible to be dangerous. The Germans had mastered a form of war built on pressure. The Soviets answered with a weapon that made pressure wait. And in war, waiting under fire can become its own form of defeat. Cheap steel, expensive delay. The mine was not impressive in the way a tank was impressive. It did not require a large crew. It did not need fuel. It did not need a train driver, a radio operator, a gunner, or a commander. It did not consume engine parts. It did not break down on a muddy road because it had no intention of moving. That was its economy. Once buried, it waited at almost no cost to the army that placed it. The cost came later, and it was paid by the man who found it too late. This imbalance is the cold mathematics of mine warfare. A relatively cheap explosive device could damage a far more expensive vehicle. But that comparison, simple as it is, still understates the effect. The real value of a mine was not only the price of the tank it might disable. It was the cost of the delay it imposed on everything behind that tank. Imagine a narrow road. The lead vehicle strikes a mine and loses a track. It blocks the lane. Engineers move forward. The column halts. Trucks cannot pass. Fuel does not reach the forward units. Ammunition remains in the rear. A battery that was supposed to support the attack arrives late. Infantry dismounts and waits in the cold. Radios fill with repeated questions. Commanders request updates. The planned timetable begins to slip. One mine, one track, one road. Now multiply that across a front where roads are few, weather is bad, maps are imperfect, and the enemy has chosen the ground. This is why the number of vehicles destroyed by mines can never tell the whole story. A damaged tank might be repaired. A minefield might eventually be cleared. A column might resume movement after hours of work. But the time is gone. The fuel is burned. The men are more tired. The attack is less synchronized. The enemy has not been idle. The Soviets understood delay as a resource. Not glamorous. Not easy to celebrate. But real. A delay could allow a gun crew to reposition. A reserve unit to arrive. A command post to relocate. A bridge to be destroyed. A defensive line to be strengthened. In a war of enormous distances, hours could become operational facts. There was also a deeper cost. Mine clearing required specialists. Engineers were never unlimited. If they were clearing one road, they were not repairing a bridge somewhere else. If they were probing under fire, they were taking casualties that could not be quickly replaced. If armored units needed pioneers before every movement, then the speed of the whole force began to depend on the availability of men crawling in the dirt. That dependency was dangerous for an army built around rapid decision. The mine imposed slowness from below. It forced a modern army to behave carefully in primitive ways. Probing, marking, crawling, listening, testing each step. It brought the machine age back into contact with the hand. A tank weighing many tons could be stopped by the fingers of an engineer who had to decide whether the next patch of soil was safe. What matters is not only the number. What matters is what the number reveals. A small object could create a large consequence when placed inside a system that depended on movement. This is true in logistics, in tactics, in morale. A blocked road is not just a road. It is a schedule, a supply line, a promise made to another unit. A plan written at headquarters, a command expectation, a risk calculation. The mine broke all of those at once. That is why German reports could sometimes fail to capture the full damage. Reports could list vehicles damaged. They could note mines cleared. They could mark routes delayed. But the deeper effect, the erosion of confidence, the disruption of tempo, the way one explosion changed decisions for miles behind it, was harder to write in a column. The Soviets did not invent fear of mines. Every army understood it. But on the Eastern Front, they made that fear operational. They turned cheap steel and explosive into expensive hesitation. And when hesitation entered the Panzer column, the battlefield no longer belonged only to armor. It belonged to whoever had prepared the next meter of ground. The men who had to clear the road. There is a cruel intimacy to mine warfare. A shell may arrive from kilometers away. A machine gun may fire from a tree. A tank may kill from across a field. But a mine waits close to the body, beneath a boot, beneath a track, beneath the hands of the man trying to disarm it. The German pioneer who crawled forward after a mine blast was not living inside the clean lines of doctrine. He was living in inches. His world narrowed to soil texture, wire fragments, disturbed mud, pressure plates, the angle of a probe, the sound of firing nearby, the weight of men waiting behind him. He could hear engines idling. He could hear officers calling for speed. He could hear artillery somewhere in the distance. He knew all of it mattered. But the mine did not care about urgency. If his hand shook, the mine remained patient. If his unit was late, the mine remained patient. If headquarters demanded the road open immediately, the mine remained patient. That patience was part of its terror. For German engineers, clearing Soviet mines was often physically exhausting and mentally corrosive. They had to work under observation, under fire, and under pressure from their own side. Every minute spent clearing a lane could invite more shelling. Every mistake could kill the man making it and the men close enough to trust him. The work demanded calm from men who had every reason to panic. The Soviet sapper faced a mirrored danger. He laid the mine knowing that he might not live to see its result. He handled explosives in darkness, often under equally severe pressure. He had to prepare the field quickly enough before the Germans arrived, accurately enough not to waste the device, and carefully enough not to kill himself or his comrades. He did not have the luxury of abstraction. He knew what the mine could do because he had touched it. On both sides, the minefield was a place where ordinary soldiers carried the burden of decisions made far above them. Commanders spoke of obstacles. The men touched them. A tank crew trapped in a disabled vehicle experienced another kind of fear. After the explosion, the crew might still be alive, but the machine that protected them had become a stationary target. A tank that cannot move cannot choose its ground. Smoke enters the compartment. Metal rings from impact. Someone checks for fire. Someone tries the radio. Someone curses the track. Someone listens for the next shell. Leaving the vehicle could be dangerous. Staying could be worse. Infantry behind the tank waited without understanding the whole situation. They saw smoke ahead, heard fragments of orders, watched engineers crawl forward. In winter, men stamped their feet to keep feeling in them. In mud, they stood ankle-deep beside trucks. In summer, dust and flies gathered around the road. Always there was the same unease. The enemy might be visible ahead, but death might already be underfoot. The medical cost of mines was often terrible. They damaged bodies in ways that were difficult to describe and harder to forget. Legs, feet, hands, faces. Men who survived were sometimes carried back through the same uncertain ground that had wounded them. Medics had to move carefully while urgency told them to run. The battlefield did not pause for pain. This is where any simple story about clever tactics becomes insufficient. Mines were effective. They could be necessary. They could save defenders by slowing attackers. They could help weaker units survive against stronger armor. But their effectiveness lived inside human suffering. There was no clean genius in a minefield. Only preparation, fear, and consequence. That does not make the story less important. It makes it more honest. Because war is not only measured by what works. It is measured by what working costs. The Soviet sapper who laid the mine and the German pioneer who tried to lift it may never have seen each other. They might have been the same age. They might both have been cold, hungry, afraid, and convinced that the next mistake would be their last. Between them lay a small object in the ground, built to remove movement from the war. And when it worked, generals might call it delay. The men called it by the sound it made. Reports could not hide the problem forever. Paper has a way of making war look more orderly than it was. A report can state that a column was delayed by mines, can list vehicles damaged. It can record engineers committed, roads cleared, time lost, routes changed. The language is usually flat because military language has to survive repetition. Cannot tremble every time a man does. But the flatness can deceive. A report might say that one tank was immobilized. It may not show the smell of burning oil inside the road cut. It may not show the officer looking at his watch while artillery starts walking toward the column. It may not show the truck drivers behind the blockage wondering whether they are sitting on the next mine. It may not show the pioneers' hands after 2 hours in frozen mud. And it may not capture the larger truth. Mines were forcing German units to change how they moved. At first, the problem could be explained away. Mines were expected in war. Engineers would handle them. Losses would be absorbed. Routes would be cleared. Armored units would continue. But repetition changes belief. When one road stops, it is an incident. When roads stop again and again, it becomes a pattern. German formations increasingly had to treat mines not as isolated nuisances, but as part of the Soviet defensive method. Routes had to be reconnoitered more carefully. Engineers had to be brought forward sooner. Mine-clearing equipment and procedures became more important. Attacks could not assume that speed alone would carry them through prepared ground. The reports may have remained technical. The behavior changed. That is often how armies admit the truth before they say it aloud. They assign more engineers. They slow formations. They alter routes. They warn units. They develop countermeasures. They spend more time on a threat they once dismissed. The battlefield forces respect long before pride allows confession. For German commanders, this was not only a tactical inconvenience. It touched the deeper identity of their way of war. Blitzkrieg, though the term itself is often used more loosely than German doctrine did, depended on concentration, surprise, coordination, and speed. Mines did not defeat those ideas by argument. They interfered with their physical conditions. A fast attack cannot remain fast if every route must be suspected. A coordinated attack becomes harder if one column is delayed while another moves ahead. A surprise attack loses force if engineers must spend hours opening lanes. A commander who does not know whether the delay is one mine or an entire belt cannot judge the next decision with confidence. The Soviets did not have to make German commanders foolish. They had to make them uncertain. And uncertainty is one of the most expensive things in war. The official recognition of mine warfare was not a single dramatic moment. It accumulated in delays, warnings, revised procedures, after-action notes, and the memories of men who had watched powerful machines halted by something buried before dawn. German soldiers at the front often understood before the institution fully expressed it. They knew which roads felt wrong. They knew what disturbed earth looked like. They knew the pause after an explosion. They knew that a quiet field could be more frightening than a noisy one. The paperwork could call it an obstacle. The men called it danger. By the time Soviet minefields became central to major defensive systems, especially in later battles where layered defenses confronted German armor, the lesson had already been paid for many times. Mines were not side details. They were part of the architecture of resistance. Still, many of the people who made that architecture possible remained unnamed. The sapper who buried the mine, the officer who guessed the route, the soldier who carried the crate through mud, the engineer who marked the field and died before seeing the result. Their recognition, if it came at all, was usually quiet. A unit citation, a note in a report, a medal for some, nothing for many. The tanks became famous. The minefields became lines on maps. The men who shaped them often disappeared into the ground they had prepared. And that is why the next part of the story matters. Because the mine did more than stop columns in one battle or one season. It left a lesson that armored armies could not forget. The invisible weapon that changed armored war. The tank remained the symbol. It is easy to understand why. A tank has shape, mass, sound. It appears in photographs, crosses fields. It breaks walls. It burns dramatically when destroyed. It gives history something visible to remember. A mine is harder to remember. Before it explodes, it is hidden. After it explodes, attention goes to what it damaged. The weapon disappears behind its result. Yet across the Eastern Front, mines help teach a lesson that every modern army had to confront. Movement is not guaranteed simply because machines are powerful. The ground has to permit movement. The enemy has to allow it. At Kursk and in other defensive battles, Soviet forces used mines as part of layered systems. They were not magic barriers. German units still advanced in places. Mines were cleared, breached, bypassed, and sometimes endured. No single weapon explains the outcome of vast battles involving artillery, armor, aircraft, infantry, logistics, command decisions, intelligence, weather, and exhaustion. But mines mattered because they changed the terms on which armor entered the fight. They slowed attacks before the decisive point. They separated formations. They exposed tanks to anti-tank guns. They forced engineers forward. They made predictable routes dangerous. They turned confidence into procedure. They made every meter demand attention. In this sense, Soviet mines were not primitive remnants of an older war. They were part of modern combined defense. A mine by itself was limited. A mine covered by fire was different. A mine placed before an anti-tank gun line was different. A minefield connected to artillery observers, trenches, wire, ditches, and reserve positions was different again. The weapon's power came not from complexity inside the device, but from intelligence in placement. That is a humbling idea. War often rewards the machine that looks advanced. The larger gun, the thicker armor, the faster aircraft, the longer range. But the Eastern Front repeatedly showed that effectiveness can come from the meeting of simple tools and harsh conditions. A felt boot can matter. A field telephone wire can matter. A shovel can matter. A mine can matter. Not because these things are glamorous. Because men depend on them when the larger systems begin to fail. The legacy of Soviet mine warfare was not that mines alone stopped German armor. That would be too simple and too false. The legacy was that mines proved armored war could be shaped by invisible preparation. They showed that a cheaper weapon could force expensive machines to obey the defender's rhythm. They reminded commanders that speed is not merely a property of engines. It is a condition created by roads, fuel, maintenance, confidence, and safety. Take away confidence in the road, and the engine is no longer enough. Post-war armies absorbed versions of this lesson in many forms. Mine clearing became more specialized. Engineers became essential to armored movement. Obstacle breaching became a central part of planning. Defensive belts, anti-tank mines, route denial, and combined obstacle systems remained part of military thinking because the logic was brutally clear. If the enemy must move, then the ground can be made into a weapon. That lesson came at a cost paid by soldiers who rarely appear in the center of the frame. The sapper in darkness. The pioneer with a probe. The driver waiting behind a burning tank. The wounded man carried back along a road no one fully trusted. The officer staring at a map and realizing the arrow he drew so confidently had become meaningless on the actual earth. This is why stories of mines deserve more than technical explanation. They reveal something about war that machines alone cannot show. Armies do not move through empty space. They move through fear, weather, terrain, fatigue, expectation, and enemy design. The Germans believed the Soviet mine was primitive because it looked simple. But simplicity was exactly why it could be everywhere. And because it could be everywhere, it changed how men moved even when it was nowhere at all. That is the final power of a minefield. It does not end at the last buried charge. It continues in the mind of the man who wonders whether the next road is safe. What the ground remembered. Return to that road west of Vyazma. Return to the cold before dawn, to the engines waiting in line, to the lead tank angled across the road with its track broken open beside it. Return to the men behind it, unable to see the full situation, but able to feel the change. A few minutes earlier, the road had been a route. After the explosion, it became a question. That is what Soviet mines did to German armored movement. Not everywhere. Not always. Not with perfect success. War is too large and too chaotic for clean conclusions. Many minefields failed. Many were cleared. Many German units pushed through terrible obstacles and kept fighting with discipline, skill, and courage. The story is not one of simple humiliation. It is one of misjudgment. The Germans thought they were looking at a crude weapon from a crude system. A box in the ground. A plate. A charge. A primitive device for an army that lacked better answers. But the battlefield does not care how impressive a weapon looks. Cares what the weapon does. And what Soviet mines did was attack the assumption beneath German armored warfare. That movement, once achieved, could be sustained. That roads existed to be used. That captured ground became safe ground. That the enemy had to be visible to stop you. The mine argued otherwise. It waited without noise. It required no courage after placement, but demanded courage before it. It did not tire. It did not panic. It did not reveal itself because a commander was impatient. It could be crude and still effective, cheap and still consequential, simple and still perfectly placed. Around it stood the human world of war. The Soviet sapper, cold and exhausted, burying explosives in the dark because there was no tank available where one was needed. The German pioneer, crawling forward under fire because the column could not move until his hands found what someone else had hidden. The tank crew trapped inside a vehicle that had not been defeated by armor, but by the road beneath it. The staff officer later trying to reduce all of it to a sentence in a report. Delayed by mines. The words are too small. They do not contain the smoke, the silence after the blast, the anger in the radio net, the driver afraid to move, the wounded man asking where his boot went, the engineer pressing a probe into mud while men behind him waited for permission to live. But history is often made of small phrases trying to hold large suffering. They believed Soviet mines were primitive. But what really happened was that the primitive weapon understood the battlefield better than the machines that tried to cross it. It understood roads. It understood fear. It understood that an army moving fast is still vulnerable to the one place it cannot avoid. The ground. And long after the engines stopped, long after the reports were filed, long after the maps were folded and the columns moved on or never did, the image remains. One broken track on a narrow road, one line of vehicles behind it, one small buried object that forced a powerful army to wait. Not forever, just long enough. In war, sometimes that is enough. If you watch this story from beginning to end, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. And if someone in your family served in the war, on any front, in any uniform, you are welcome to share their name or memory below. Warfront Archive is built for these overlooked stories. The quiet weapons, the forgotten soldiers, and the moments when what armies believed met what the battlefield proved. Subscribe to continue hearing the stories that history often leaves beneath the surface.